Morning, if you are in the West Coast like I am. Good afternoon if you are in the East Coast like some of our panelists. And good evening if you are joining us from further away across the ocean. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I convene the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association's online meetings. Today, I would like to first start by sharing my screen, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what is coming up in our series next month. You all know why you're here, a companion to Early Modern Istanbul, a book panel in loving memory of Yavuz Sezer, which I will introduce in a second. But let me first tell you just a bit about our programming for next month while I have you there. In our series of Turkey Now, which is an occasional series, not every month, but sort of depending on the what is going on in Turkey and interest in talks, we have something on Cyprus, the gray zones of suspended sovereignty, Turkey and the rise of wild capitalism in Cyprus. Rebecca Bryan and Meta Hatay will talk about their recently published book, and Reshat Kasaba and George Kiris will be the moderators of that panel. And then later in April, in the OTSA Co-op series, which is also an occasional series, we will host over a dozen of Ottoman history podcasts, longtime contributors to celebrate the Ottoman history podcast that has been with us for more than a decade by now. They've been doing a great job in bringing Ottoman history to our ears while we are driving, traveling, anywhere we might be, and also taking it to people who are not necessarily professional historians. They deserve our appreciation, so we thought we'll host them and let them tell us about their stories. And in the series, What's Up in Ottoman Turkish Studies next month, we will host Ana Sekulic, who won an honorable mention in our article prize last year. And she's going to present to us not just the article that actually got the honorable mention, but the larger context of her work, Archives, Empire, and Community, Ottoman Paper in Catholic Spaces. Molly Green will moderate the session, and Heather Ferguson will be our discussant. And having mentioned Heather Ferguson, I would also like to announce that our new editor for the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association will be Heather Ferguson. She is starting her job literally today. Now, let's come back to the panel today. Today is a special panel. I am very, very excited about it. This is sort of in its own, little context, a historic moment, because we are launching a new prize. And this prize is the result of the work of many people. Maybe I should first start by reminding those of our members who, will know that last year we had an advisory committee that sort of provided us with some recommendations about creating some procedures on prizes, and one of them was, opening a path for new prizes, and that required at least 10 members to come together, bring a petition to the board, and then that petition to be discussed at a membership meeting, and then also bringing funds together, pledging them, and then actually producing them. And 10 people, by working very hard, did this for the friend that they lost, Yavuz Sezer, a year ago yesterday. We lost Yavuz to COVID on March 24th, 2021. And his friends will tell you about him, so I'm not going to tell you about Yavuz, but I would like to acknowledge the people who made this prize possible. So the signatories, as their names appeared on the petition that I shared with our membership, were Gülru Necipoğlu, whom you will hear from in a little bit. And I should also mention, Gülru hocamız was one of the recipients of the Köprülü Prize. And so it is very fitting that a prize that was given to the history of architecture by our association now is opening again with Gülru Hanım's leadership a way into a new prize, at this time an article prize. Other signatories included Selim Kuru, whom you will also hear about today, Ayşe Baltacıoğlu Brammer from New York University, Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz, whom you will hear from in a minute, Deniz Türker, whom also you will hear from in a minute, Aslıhan Gürbüzel from McGill, and I would like to especially acknowledge Aslıhan, as she was the one who provided the connection between the board and the friends and colleagues of Yavuz Sezer who worked toward the creation of this prize. Seçil Yılmaz from Franklin and Marshall College, Mehmet Kentel from Istanbul Research Institute, İstanbul Araştırmaları Enstitüsü, Murat Şiviloğlu from Trinity College in Dublin, and Akif Yerlioğlu from Boğaziçi University. And donors who pledged funds include again Gülru Necipoğlu and Cemal Kafader, Deniz Türker, Murat Şiviloğlu, and Aslıhan Gürbüzel. I thank them all on behalf of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association for their donations, which reached us already. So we now have a fund of $2,000 devoted to this prize that will be given every 2 years in the amount of $200. So we are covered for the next 20 years. But in the meantime, we'll do some fundraising in few years with some, infrequently, to make sure it would not just be 20, but 200 may be. And we already did a test run of that, and there were some donations that I will thank in person over email. The inaugural prize committee consists of, as you can see on the screen, the chair is Çiğdem Kafescioğlu at Boğaziçi University, and the members are Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz and Deniz Türker, whom I will introduce in a moment as the co-chairs of the panel today. Shirine Hamadeh from Koç University was the OTSA board liaison for this prize committee. Shirine worked with Çiğdem and others to draft the poll for the prize that you are looking at on your screen. I'm very grateful to Shirine for that. So now, as you can see, April 30th is the deadline. We are looking forward to receiving, that is, Çiğdem will be receiving, but eventually they will be reading your articles and book chapters, and then eventually naming a prize winner whom we will hear about in December at the MESA meeting. So please feel free to nominate your own article or book chapter, or nominate someone else's. It could be an article published in a journal. It could be a book chapter in a edited volume. So please go to your computers and send that email. Now, for our panel today, we decided that we will keep introductions short to have time for more talking about the work that's been done. So I will keep it very, very brief. Our chairs, co-chairs today are Ümit Fırat Açıkgöz, an assistant professor at the American University of Beirut's Department of Architecture and Design. Currently, he is a postdoctoral fellow in the Agahan program for Islamic architecture at Harvard University. And Deniz Türker is an assistant professor of Islamic art and architecture at Rutgers, New Brunswick, who specializes in late Ottoman material and visual cultures. Her forthcoming book on the Yıldız Palace is the product of an adventure-filled outing with Yavuz in the summer of 2009. Yes, Deniz, Ümit, please take it away.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Baki, for the introduction. On behalf of Yavuz Sezer's friends, I would also like to thank Otsa and Baki Tezcan for their support in making possible the Yavuz Sezer Article Prize in the History of Ottoman Architecture and the Urban Environment. So we are very happy today that the prize is now official. This article prize is one of a series of commemorative events, commemorative initiatives Yavuz's friends put together since he passed away a year ago. I'm going to mention these events, these initiatives very soon, but before that, let me explain the structure of today's meeting. We have 4 speakers and 2 moderators. I will be moderating the first half of the meeting. First, I will provide a brief biography of Yavuz Sezer, and secondly, I will introduce the first 2 speakers, Çiğdem Kafescioğlu and Shirine Hamadeh, who will talk about their edited book, A Companion to Early Modern Istanbul. Then Deniz Türker will step in as the moderator of the second half of the meeting. She will introduce the 2 contributors to the volume in question, Gülru Necipoğlu and Selim Kuru. Denis will also moderate the Q&A session. Yavuz Sezer was born in Istanbul in 1979. He spent his childhood in Fatih and Koca Mustafa Pasha, surrounded by some of the most impressive Ottoman and Byzantine monuments of Istanbul. In the 1990s, Yavuz attended Vefa High School, in the courtyard of which is located the Şehit Ali Pasha Library, one of the 18th century Ottoman libraries he would later examine in his doctoral dissertation. Between 1997 and 2005, Boğaziçi University was Yavuz's home institution. During these formative years of his scholarship, Yavuz found an intellectual home within Boğaziçi's history department, where he received his bachelor's and master's degrees. At Boğaziçi, Yavuz took various courses in history of architecture and urbanism, partook in research and exhibition projects, and acquired his first teaching experiences as a TA for Boğaziçi's famous math course, Making of the Modern World. Almost 2 decades later today, his students in these sessions still fondly remember Yavuz as a passionate and deeply knowledgeable teaching assistant. In his master's thesis, Yavuz explored how Ottoman domestic architecture became historic heritage and an inspiration for architectural practice in the early decades of the 20th century. Between 2007 and 2008, Yavuz worked as an instructor at Koç University. He left Koç to enroll in the PhD program in history, theory, and criticism of architecture at MIT. Yavuz took his PhD in 2016 upon the completion of his dissertation entitled Architecture of Bibliophilia, 18th Century Ottoman Libraries. In this widely commended study, Yavuz explored more than 20 purpose-designed libraries at the intersection of architecture, urban culture, architecture, book culture, and the larger political and social transformations of the Ottoman Empire during the 18th century. Between 2013 and 2021, Yavuz worked as an instructor at Istanbul Bilgi University, where he offered various courses in history of art, architecture, and urban environment. Among Yavuz's publications are a book chapter titled Bir Türk Aşiyanı Yapmak, 20. yüzyıl başlarında geleneksel Osmanlı evinin tarihi miras ve mimari model olarak algılanışı, which appeared in Mimar Kemalettin ve Çağı, edited by Ali Cengiz Khan, and an article titled Hungarian Orientalism, Turanism, and Karoli Kor's Istanbul, which appeared at Centropa, a journal of Central European architecture and related arts. On March 24, 2021, exactly a year and a day ago, Yavuz Sezer passed away due to COVID-19 related complications. Having waited with lots of hope during his several days at the intensive care unit of an Istanbul hospital, his friends, colleagues, students, and family members were devastated by Yavuz's death at only 41. Yavuz was a caring and compassionate friend to dozens of us, a wonderful teacher to hundreds of his students, and one of the most brilliant historians of his generation. His passion for history, architecture, and urban environment was simply unmatched. In early April 2021, a group of his friends, who eventually named themselves Yavuz Sezer Memorial Initiative, began working on several projects to commemorate him. Now, a year after we lost our beloved friends, it gives us some consolation to see that all our initial plans have come to fruition. On May 29, 2021, we organized a memorial meeting on Zoom where his siblings and several friends, colleagues, and students from different stages of his career shared their memories of Yavuz. For those who might be interested in watching the memorial meeting, our friends are now sharing the YouTube link in the chat box. In that memorial meeting, we also raised funds for the Yavuz Sezer Scholarship in Architectural and Urban History offered by Boğaziçi University's History Department. The scholarship is now official, and enough funds were raised to make it a permanent one. Another important initiative was to organize an annual memorial lecture series in Yavuz's name. With the support of Istanbul Research Institute, Research Center for Anatolian Civilizations, Boğaziçi University's Department of History, and the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Initiative, the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Talks started as of October 2021. Each year, the series will host a historian whose work has made substantial contribution to the three pillars of Yavuz scholarship: history of architecture, urban environment, and book culture. Roger Chartier delivered the inaugural lecture on October 6, 2021. Again, we share the YouTube link of that lecture in the chat box, but please make sure to watch them later. Don't leave this meeting. Yavuz has spent incredible emotional and intellectual energy for his dissertation over several years. It was on top of his future plans to see the dissertation's publication in a book format by an international academic publishing house. We are very glad to announce today that a lot of steps have been taken in this front during the past year. A contract with a prestigious university press is about to be signed for the posthumous publication of Yavuz's book. We hope to share more good news on this later this year. Last but not the least, in June 2021, his friends, colleagues, and professors at Boğaziçi University, together with his two siblings, planted a Judas tree in a beautiful spot off the campus overlooking the Bosphorus. As those who are familiar with Istanbul would know very well, Judas trees, erguvan, are a distinctive element of Istanbul's landscape, especially in April and May, when their purple flowers dot the hills overlooking the Bosphorus. Less than a year after it was planted, Yavuz erguvan, or Judas tree, is about to be budding. Soon, its flowers will blossom and make Yavuz's memory a part of the landscape of his beloved Istanbul and Boğaziçi University. When OTSA approached us with the idea of announcing the Yavuz Sezer Article Prize as part of a scholarly event, we did not need to think too much. Little could be more timely and appropriate to Yavuz's memory than organizing today's meeting around a companion to Istanbul, a companion to Early Modern Istanbul, edited by Çiğdem Kafescioğlu and Shirine Hamadeh. It is timely because the book appeared very recently, last October, from Brill. It is appropriate because the book's scope and framework perfectly overlaps with Yavuz's areas of research. When we approached Çiğdem and Shirine, they both enthusiastically accepted the invitation. On behalf of the Yavuz Sezer Memorial Initiative, I would like to thank them, as well as the two contributors that join us today, Gülru Necipoğlu and Selim Kuru. As it will soon be clear, a companion to Early Modern Istanbul is a major contribution to the field at multiple levels. The book focuses on Istanbul, but it tells us a lot about the Ottoman Empire at large, as well as the world beyond. It focuses on the early modern period, but offers stimulating thoughts about and critical insights into what came before and after. The chapters cover a very wide range of topics in the social, spatial, cultural, intellectual, and economic history of early modern Istanbul. So therefore, today's meeting is bound to be very productive and inspiring. None of today's speakers need any introduction. As it is always the case, however, introducing those who need no introduction is a daunting task. In addition, there are 4 of them today, in addition to 2 moderators, and we have already spent about 15 minutes introducing the prize and our late Yavuz Sezer. For all these reasons, the introduction of speakers will be very brief today. Those who happen to be unfamiliar with their work know what to do for further information, which is just a few clicks away. So our speakers today will have each about 10 minutes. I'm going to introduce the first 2 speakers together, the editors of the book, and they will speak one after the other, and I'm not going to intervene in between them. The first speaker is Shirine Hamadeh. Shirine is an associate professor in the Department of Archaeology and History of Art at Koç University. She specializes in Ottoman urban history and early modern history. Among Shirine's many publications, I would like to mention her book, Cities, Pleasures, Istanbul in the 18th Century, which was published in 2007 by the University of Washington Press. Our second speaker, Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, is a professor in the Department of History at Boğaziçi University. Çiğdem specializes in the urban, architectural, and visual culture of the early modern Ottoman world. Like Shirine, Çiğdem also published extensively, but I will limit myself here to mentioning her book, Constantinopolis/Istanbul, Cultural Encounter, Imperial Vision, and the Construction of the Ottoman Capital, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2009. Again, thank you so much, Shirine and Çiğdem, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ümit, for your introduction and for this beautiful tribute. And thank you to all of you, Baki, Aslıhan, Denis, and Ümit, for organizing this gathering in memory of Yavuz, and for asking us to present our companion volume on early modern Istanbul as part of this gathering. It is actually even more fitting than Ümit noted that we do bring these 2 events together, since Yavuz was supposed to be one of the contributors to this book project. And certainly many of his intellectual concerns would have resonated in the book. I also want to thank, on behalf of the 2 of us, all the authors in the volume, those with us today, Gülru and Selim, and those not, all 24 of them, who have made this project possible and who have endured with us this long process, and our countless emails and reminders and editing suggestions and more editing suggestions. So we really want to take this opportunity to say how much we have learned from their contributions and from the many connections that started emerging gradually and later on between these contributions. So a very big and heartfelt thank you to all of you. Now, in the 10 minutes or maybe less that I have, I will try to briefly present the book framework and say a little bit about the way we conceived it, envisioned it, our general approach, what we wanted this volume to be. And then Çiğdem will focus on one specific aspect of it that we thought important to highlight today, which is the place of urban and architectural history in the story of early modern Istanbul. So when we were asked by Brill to put together a volume on early modern Istanbul to be published as part of an ongoing series, a Brill series on European history, we immediately saw, of course, the potential that this offered to introduce Istanbul's early modern history to this European framework. And incite a sort of observation of local developments within and in relation to a more global geography, or in fewer words, to look at early modern urbanity through the Istanbulite lens. What also struck us from the start was that a considerable body of scholarship had come out in the past 20, 30 years across disciplines that directly or indirectly or even unwittingly addressed questions of early modernity in Istanbul, and that this was a good time and opportunity to bring all this research together and to see how the various pieces could be brought to bear on one another in order to spotlight Istanbul as a key site of early modern urbanity. Now, some of you probably know that our individual work as urban and architectural historians of Istanbul roughly bracket the early modern era in its conventional chronological definition, with Çiğdem's in the late 15th century and mine in the 18th. And what has interested us all along was the conjunction of historical developments that occurred in this time span and their cumulative significance, more so than, say, questioning the teleological implications of early modernity. And that's really how we envisioned the volume, as a team project, a collective project in which we would hoard together various facets and layers of these developments. And for both of us, the urban, so urban structures, urban culture, urbanity, has been very central to formulations of the early modern. So basically, we started out with this conviction, which guided the making of the book and its overall structure from the start, that we could create a space that allows for reflection on early modern historical developments in their own right, and give legitimacy to historical processes within the span of time we call the early modern. And if for some authors, the early modern ends or ended in 1826 or 1839 or the 1840s, for many, it was best spotlighted in a concentrated few decades or century, depending on their vantage points and areas of investigation. And many of these developments had already been identified by scholars, whether in the urban institutions, building types, in patterns of urbanization, in trade, local and global, in consumption, in the way that knowledge circulated, in the political and legal frameworks of the urban experience itself, in demographic growth and the many implications of this growth, in forms and spaces and expressions of urbanity, in the public and political presence of urbanites, in the involvement of urbanites in the transformation of the material environment, among others. So the decisions we took about the structure of the book were very much informed by developments that had been identified in relation to the early modern context. For example, we opened the volume with chapters on the city folks, not with the conventionally more privileged palace folks, because we recognized that their presence and engagement in the public arena was a very significant feature of the early modern city. Or, for example, instead of, again, the more conventional book structure that would have the state, the court, palace, society in separate and discrete chapters, what we wanted to put forth was the interface or the dynamics between palace and city that evidence had shown already was characteristic of this time. And so many chapters in the volume on the political elite, on artistic production, so very varied chapters on ceremonial, on infrastructure, on the urban infrastructure, underscore precisely this interface. Now, there's another important consideration we had in putting the book structure together that is also central to our individual work and methodology as urban and architectural historians. And that's the attention we give to space and the material environment. We were very keen on having this volume grounded, so to speak, in the urban space, to the extent, of course, possible or even relevant. We are very keen on integrating, on thinking of the city's materiality, be it its topography, its architecture, its streets, waters, specific buildings, in relation to topics and questions that don't usually seem to necessitate such considerations. So the book does not isolate the physical city, as is usually the case in such edited volumes, like in a separate chapter or section on architecture or urban transformations. But rather, the city's spatial and material dimension runs across the book, whether in discussions on trade, on intercommunal relations, on masculinity, on literature, music, agriculture, ceremonials, natural catastrophes, urban revolts, among others. And I think I will stop here, and I think my colleagues will say more about these last points. So I will pass on the mic to Çiğdem.
Okay, all right, thank you, Shirine. Let me just start by saying how glad I am that the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association has initiated this article award, and that it is now one among these few scholarly events that Ümit already mentioned that will help us keep Yavuz's memory alive. And it will also, of course, be a way of paying tribute to the work he has done in the history of architecture for those of you who are in this part of the world. Very soon we hope to meet under Yavuz's Erguvan once it fully blooms. And although Shirine has already done this on my behalf too, let me also very, very briefly begin by offering my thanks to our authors for their dedication and their patience through this long process of the volume's making, and for everything that we have learned from them. Thank you also to those of you who are here today. Another way that this event is meaningful for us and for me as someone who followed Yavuz from his undergraduate years through to his becoming one of the most promising architectural historians of his generation, is that, as Shirine noted, Yavuz was one of our authors initially. We wanted him to be part of this, particularly because his contribution would be intimately linked to the way we imagined the volume, because of the way he grounded his research in the intersections of social and intellectual dynamics with design and production of works of architecture. His work on 18th century libraries connects to several of the salient points of early modern urban dynamics in its highlighting new social configurations as they bore on emerging public institutions and their architecture, new modes of engaging with multiple pasts and with the Adab legacy, which added up to an intellectual endeavor that found reflections in novel modes of architectural design, which Yavuz very creatively and succinctly elucidated on. The chapter for the book was not to be, but the work is there. Let me say a few more things on this, the issue of early modernity in connection to the urban and to connections of urban spatiality. As Shirine said, one of our aims was to situate the actors and the topics at hand within the spaces and within the materiality of the city. This meant the privileging of the spatial in the book's organization. We, of course, welcome the spatial turn that has arrived in Ottoman studies. It may be worth underlining also that the notion of space in its multiple meanings and multiple possibilities, touching on the physical, the social, the political, also has a longer past in urban studies and in urban history than the relatively recent turn. That for long it has been within the toolbox of urban historians in their endeavors to understand connections, networks, links between different arenas and experiences of urban life, and increasingly more visibly also in the connections between cities and their immediate and larger hinterlands. It may also be worth noting here that we also saw this as a perspective that we, as two people who have worked on architecture and on issues related to urbanism and modes of urbanity, could offer to the study of the city. So to put it more bluntly, perhaps, readers may wonder how and why the two of us who spent at least part of their lives as researchers focused on the history of architecture undertook editing this volume and in this particular format. Our answer may be this. This is evidently not an architectural history volume, but in its structure and in many of its chapters, it carries the distinct stamp of spatial thinking and attention to physicality of particular places, and also of processes of association building, of cultural and commercial exchange, and also, as it comes through in many of the chapters, attention to the materiality of urban life. So that, and equally important to us, this perspective has rendered it possible to locate spatial dynamics, whether these were physical or social or both, as central to early modern urbanism and to emerging notions of urbanity connected to it. And why should urban space and issues of spatiality be of particular importance to this project and to this era in particular? Let me try to articulate this and also to connect it to the work of Gülru and Selim, who from very different perspectives do indeed bring in issues related to the structures and the physicality of urban space in the early modern era. Both from the viewpoint of urbanites and from the viewpoint of the central state apparatus and its agents, which we have to reckon were ever present in pre-modern Istanbul, the era we have bracketed between the later 15th and the early 19th centuries saw new modes of involvement with the city. This meant that the urban environment carried the imprint. It was shaped and transformed by the involvement and by the participation of a larger number of people and communities. Newly emerging forms of association throughout these centuries or through at certain points within this bracket of time made it possible for groups, whether professional or artisanal communities, for Sufi communities, for the various confessional communities living in the city, to partake in the making and the dynamics of the city and the physical environment to a greater extent than what is visible to us perhaps in earlier centuries. New modes of capital formation and transformation of property relations and economic exchange led to new land use patterns, as becomes evident, for example, in Alex Chopov's work, also in the volume. So that the material environment and the city's buildings are very much there in many of the book's chapters, not only as stages to various goings on, but as integral constituents of urban dynamics. One observed this in the involvement of communities in church building and restorations, for example, as addressed in Karen Leal's chapter. One observes this in the very centrality of spatial politics in articulations of popular dissent, as brought out by Gülay Yılmaz in her work on protests, rebellions, and revolts. One observes this in the different positioning of Sufi convents within the space of the city vis-a-vis centers of power. One also observes this as the early modern state repositioned and exerted itself in the urban arena more forcefully, while at the same time giving way to more forceful expressions of opposition and dissent on the part of the urbanites. This not only regarding state policies vis-a-vis communal relations or commercial exchanges, but also in the public presence of the court, the courtly ceremonial expanding into the urban arena rather than being largely confined in the palace, as brought out in Zeynep Yelçe's chapter, or in the Ottoman Sultan's grand architectural gestures that have imparted Istanbul with its renowned image, each designed with different choices of visual and physical presence and access, and also the public debate that was prompted by them, not always and often not completely positive, as explored by Zeynep Yürekli. So that brings me to two of our contributors who are with us here, Gülru Necipoğlu and Selim Kuru, who have also engaged with issues of architecture and the places of the city on the part of Gülru as linked to mythical space and the vicissitudes of the vernacular in a disaster-prone urban environment, and on Selim's part, spatial configurations in connection to notions of urbanity and articulations of masculinity. So I will be passing this on to Gülru for more on how architecture comes into the volume and her take on it.
Thank you, Shirine and Çiğdem. You have already offered us a lot of food for discussion. I'm sure some of these points will come back during the Q&A, but first we'll listen to our third and fourth speakers today. For introducing them and for moderating the rest of the panel, I leave the floor now to Deniz Türker.
Thank you, Çiğdem and Shirine, for allowing us to commemorate Yavuz alongside your wonderful publication today. Also to the members of OTSA and to all of you for joining us today to sustain Yavuz's memory. One wishes that we had this type of gathering for Yavuz's book talk with him among us, but alas, I will introduce the speakers this time one at a time. So I'll introduce Gülru, and then she'll give us her talk, and then Selim, and we will reserve the Q&A to the end of their talks, where you can at that point raise your hand and ask the question, or you can type it up in the chat box, and I will read it out. As Ümit has already said, our next two speakers also need no introduction. It's a privilege to be introducing two mentors of mine who initiated me and many others here into the field of Ottoman history. Gülru Necipoğlu is the Aga Khan Professor and Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard. For most of us, especially architectural historians, her prolific and rigorous scholarship has defined lasting frameworks in understanding the early modern visual and material culture of the Mediterranean and beyond by foregrounding connectivities between Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal worlds alongside cross-cultural exchanges with Byzantium and Renaissance Europe. Her publications include Architecture, Ceremonial, and Power, the Topkapı Palace, the Topkapı Scroll, The Age of Sinan, but she's also recently edited Treasures of Knowledge and Inventory of the Ottoman Palace Library alongside Cemal Kafadar and Cornel Fleischer, but she's also edited a compendium of Islamic art and architecture with Barry Flood, which came out in 2017. Among many accolades, Professor Necipoğlu is a member of the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And the title of her contribution to the Istanbul volume and to today's event is Volatile Urban Landscapes Between Mythical Space and Time.
Thank you, Denis, for this. You said you would give a short introduction, but it was extremely generous. And I'm deeply honored and touched to contribute to this ever since the days when he was a brilliant graduate student at MIT, while I was teaching in the same city at Harvard. Although I was not officially an advisor of Yavuz, I had the pleasure of having him audit some of my seminars. And since then, we kept in touch, especially when we were working with Cemal and Cornel on the library, edited library book. We talked a lot about libraries. It is indeed fitting occasion to launch the article prize in his honor today, by focusing on the recently published book, masterfully co-edited by Çiğdem and Shirine. So I will not comment that much on this book because they have introduced it, but I must say that it does engage with subjects about which Yavuz was very passionate. And in my view, this book is unsurpassed in its multidisciplinary and multi-dimensional focus on Istanbul's early modernity. So it does include several essays on the material environment of the city, a subject that was cherished by Yavuz, who was an architectural historian. Like many of us, also including Shirine and Çiğdem, he started with the material and built environment of the city with a specific building type, which he related to many social and political and intellectual issues. The environment and the environmental dimension of Istanbul, which is central to my chapter in the companion to Early Modern Istanbul, therefore connects with the work of Yavuz. My chapter is titled Istanbul's Volatile Urban Landscapes Between Mythical Space and Time. By examining the simultaneous impact of natural disasters on the city's vernacular fabric and its imaginaries, I connect two dimensions that have previously been treated separately. Namely, separate studies on Istanbul's environmental catastrophes, on which there are many studies, even catalogs, and equally separate studies on its vernacular architecture, consisting of houses, shops, and streetscapes. A third dimension in my chapter is Istanbul's apocalyptic identity, which was a shared motif in the city's Byzantine, European, and Ottoman foundation myths. With its perpetually devastated and rebuilt volatile urban landscapes, the millennial cosmopolis became an embodiment of mythical space and time. Its final destruction by calamities was commonly believed to be an apocalyptic sign of the end of days. Especially after the catastrophic 1509 earthquake named the Small Doomsday, Istanbul's vernacular architecture became dominated by timber-framed, anti-seismic houses not exceeding 2 stories. What is really interesting is that there were very specific building codes which indicated the colors in which the buildings could be painted or not painted, which separated different communities, but also the heights of houses, which are much earlier than these classifications appeared in Europe, for example. Unlike earthquake-prone masonry constructions, wooden edifices increased the risk of fires, from which the metropolis suffered periodically. The two construction techniques therefore canceled each other out in averting multiple hazards. Namely, stone constructions were good for the risk of fires, whereas the wooden ones for earthquakes. But when you have both risks continuously present, you have to privilege one or the other. In the case of Istanbul, of course, wood being a material that was widely available in the Black Sea region, which also is true for Russia and the Balkans, it became the preferred building material. And interestingly, this was also the case in Japan, which had the two risks equally, the earthquakes and the fires. In Japan too, where earthquake-resistant timber dwellings were preferred, this gave rise to recurrent fires. As Yavuz Sezer's excellent dissertation has shown, public libraries that emerged in 18th century Istanbul as a new building type included fireproof stone chambers called taş oda. And in a way, we know, of course, there were public reading spaces before, but as Yavuz has shown, a new independent building type emerged, which, I mean, given these taş oda, even the taş oda could not protect the books completely. And we have to imagine how much has been lost to these fires besides the architecture and human lives, etc. His excellent thesis entitled The Architecture of Bibliophilia, 18th Century Ottoman Libraries, engages with multiple fields from architectural and urban history to the cultural history of reading and books. Return to my chapter in the companion book. It highlights the inability of the Ottoman state to mitigate Istanbul's vulnerability as a risk city, despite the existence of well-formulated building codes devised largely by chief architects, including Sinan. During and aftermath of major fires, Istanbul's precarious vernacular fabric reconfigured itself constantly around the more permanent foci of stone buildings, which were socio-religious monuments. Fires were moreover complemented by less frequent earthquakes, ticking like a time bomb beneath the soil and seabed. Reconstructions of the cityscape after each environmental disaster reenacted the ancient apocalyptic prophecy that Istanbul would suffer periodic destructions until its final obliteration. During cyclical calamities, imaginary and vernacular Istanbul therefore became almost interchangeable, one and the same. To conclude, my chapter on this specific theme poses larger questions about Istanbul's architectural, urban, social, and environmental history, as well as its imaginaries and spatiality, materiality, and placemaking. In fact, this connectivity between multiple themes and disciplines is a key feature of the companion to early modern Istanbul and of Yavuz Sezer's exemplary scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you, Gülru. And now to our honorary art historian of the day, Selim Kuru is an associate professor and director of the Turkish and Ottoman Studies program in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Washington. Trained as a philologist, he is a historian of Western Turkish literature from the 13th century to the present, whose research interests tackle but are definitively not limited to formulations of gender in Ottoman and modern Turkish literatures, literary circles, and literary competition in Anatolian Turkic city-states and the Ottoman Empire. Testament to his wide-ranging interests and knowledge is that he has recently very generously accompanied my interest in the arts and literatures of the Turkish interwar years, for instance. Among his most recent publications are Generic Desires, Homoerotic Love in Ottoman Turkish Poetry, which appeared in Mediterranean Crossing, Sexual Transgressions in Islam and Christianity, 10th to the 18th centuries, a volume edited by Umberto Grassi, and Kafiri Mihrab'da Eğrilik, Baki'nin Mektubu, Muhibbi'nin Beyti, Crooked Altar of the Infidel, a letter from the poet Baki, and a couplet by Muhibbi, which appeared in the Journal of Turkish Studies in 2020. He has also written an enlightening, wonderful article on the context of Reşat Ekrem Koçu's encyclopedic practice, which is in the February issue of Toplumsal Tarih. Today, he will talk to us through his contribution to the Brill Companion entitled Istanbul, the City of Men, or was it?
Yes, thank you, Denis. It is nerve-breaking to talk after Gülru Necipoğlu, of course. It takes courage, but I'm rather foolish, not courageous. So bear with me. I will not talk like I met Yavuz. I haven't had the opportunity to meet Yavuz, but I am really honored to be talking in a panel organized in his memory, because his work bringing together books and architecture like pushes me to think further into Istanbul and literature. I'm also thankful all the organizers and the OTSA. When I was invited to write about Man of Istanbul for this brilliant collection, by Shirine and Çiğdem, I first resisted. I wanted to write on literature, my own room. Then learning that Walter Andrews, whom we lost 2 years ago before, unfortunately, the book came out, and there is a last sentence in the preface by the editors I appreciated a lot in his memory. When I learned that Walter is writing it with our student, Oscar Aguirre Manduano, my colleague now, I accepted to do The Man of Istanbul, pun may be intended. In the end, the long journey of writing this short chapter had a profound impact on my understanding of Ottoman Turkish literary production and the meanings that are endowed in high literary cultural texts. In a recent text, for example, I was able to think on the affectations of masculinity in the ghazal genre, trying to link that genre to the social realities of Ottoman man, elite man. My chapter ended up reflecting a literary thinking rather than scholarly writing. It is vague and avoids making a statement about the core issue, and semi-formed argument dances around the question I started with. This was a big question for me as a literary scholar who was trained to read texts and different methodologies than reading cityscapes. How to define culturally produced gender, in this case manhood, spatially and temporally in a particular place, is still a very difficult question for me after writing this chapter. So I avoided temporality thanks to the early modern vagueness of the time period suggested. And as a result, the chapter neglects change in performances of masculinity in time, a time unit of hundreds of years, for example. In working on this chapter, I considered 3 concepts as central and related to each other: multitude, entanglement, and staging. Multitude was a large population of Istanbul, and man as the visible majority in this multitude from the contemporary texts. Entanglement implied the mixing of man from vertically and horizontally different matrices of engagement with the city, and fluidity of masculinity that comes around due to this mixing of different manhoods, I would like to call. And staging is about the sites that defined and modulated different forms of masculinity, thanks to the entangled nature of homosocial interaction in Istanbul that Istanbul availed. My first instinct was to scan Istanbul for spaces and places that were intended for man, leaving out domestic space. Military barracks, for example, medrese cells and courtyards and taverns. Shirine Hamadeh's work on single man in the 17th century was eye-opening for me, and Shirine's work combined with, for example, 16th century author Latifi's stress on the multitude of men who, according to Latifi, were constantly devoured by the city that was described as a man-hungry widow, became a central and haunting image for me while writing this article. Latifi's lamenting look at man in their ignorance, constantly falling into the traps of a urban setting set up for them, shaped my focus. Of course, while writing the article, I was able to understand how these victims of the city shaped the city by their actions just before they were devoured. How to define the city is still a major topic. Cities expand, yet their depth is more interesting for me, which may be due to my training in deep reading of texts, and then city becomes a text. How the urban formations establish a core that keeps, like a kernel around which the flesh forms. In turn, the weaker flesh of the fruit strengthens its pith. For me, it was the district between the pith of Istanbul was the district between Unkapanı and At Meydanı, more or less, or Edirne Kapı and Marmara, where an entanglement occurred and multitude peaked thanks to barracks, ports, marketplaces, public squares, bathhouses, taverns, large mosques and their courtyards, libraries, for example. This was the centrifugal space for Istanbulites and visitors for the city. Fixed architectural landmarks, utilitarian structures that defined that region also engendered the mean streets that change shape around them in a flux. So this fixed cityscape and its surroundings, networks developed around it made this district, which may be called Mese, Divan Yolu, and Environs, Haliç, and Mese, between Haliç and Mese, was the pit, the kernel I was looking at when I think about the fruit of Istanbul in our minds, like taste the fruit. To capture the man who had populated this district is very difficult in any period of time. Vertically defined boundaries of craftsmen, Janissary corps, workers, officers, merchants, sailors, slaves, and horizontal, or may also be considered vertical in some contexts, determiners of race, ethnicity, sexual tendencies, place of origin, that complicates and in a way cancels attempts to define pre-modern identities in the space and points to the fluid nature of identity as a concept. And we should discuss, the validity of this concept for historical research. Still, boundaries that define identities become visible in work in solidarity during times of conflict, for example. Yet in this space, those kind of identity markers that got to deform and or reform in time. My attempt in that sense, it sounded impossible and frustrated Çiğdem and Shirine on different periods of writing this short chapter very much, was not so trying to define masculine identity. So the vagueness of the chapter is because of its subject matter in a sense, but to show the fragile nature of masculine performances that happen in proximity in spaces where men were mixing, again, the kernel of Istanbul. Arya Salzman's article, Islampolis, Cosmopolis, which underscores proximity and economic activity as the basis of this mixing, was foundational as Latifi, for example, for my thinking, or it became an anchor. Working on Ottoman Turkish literature, my approach focuses on the elite, non-elite binary and underscores the elite origins of historical thinking. In a sense, there are opposite currents. On the one hand, there are the source material, contemporary source material, which imposes a frame on our imagination of past. On the other hand, there are the modern issues that sneak into methodologies and causes another frame that we impose upon those texts. So how to break free out of these frames or imagine that we may was one of the critical approaches I hope the chapter implies silently, like in its tides and ebbs of thinking about man. I attempted to identify what I call the majority of men that put the city into action with their professional and personal backgrounds, activities, those who were generally disdained by Ottoman high literature, like Turkish authors, and by non-Muslim elite authors of the city as well, from their less advantaged vantage points. Now, I realized still I fell into their vision while trying to challenge them. And their gaze in this first attempt to write about masculinity and its performances in Istanbul. In my attempt to represent the sheer diversity of Istanbulite male population, I might have neglected to underscore the diversity among the elite. I would like to have read Ezgi Dikici's amazing recent article about the eunuchs, for example, palace agas, and their appropriation of land in Istanbul, their desire for the city. In the recent issue of Yıllık by the Istanbul Research Institute. Before writing this chapter, that would have helped. Throughout the article, I tried to employ masculine, male, or manhood instead of man, in an attempt to imply that masculine performance was to some degree available for any human individual in any biological sex. For example, the case of Mihri discussed by Çiğdem Kafescioğlu in the field of poetic performances of masculinity. I considered the simple title of the chapter, City of Man, as a provocation in reference to Christian de Pizan's early 15th century utopian vision, the book of the City of Ladies, in order to underscore an understanding of pre-modern, early modern, even modern, if not current, urban setting as a masculine formation. So my questions linger on the specificity of the urban space and with respect to gender and specifically Istanbul in the formation of these various gendered performances and the impact of those on the cityscapes, as well as possibilities of transgression that was central to an understanding of change in the city. For the aspect of spatial formation of Istanbul, of course, Çiğdem and Gülru's work, along with Tülay Artan, Süreyya Faruqi, as well as Selma Özkoçak's were crucial, and those added a different perspective to works on social history that I benefited by: Robert Bentran, Cemal Kafadar, Stefan Yerasumos, Gülay Yılmaz, and many, many others. The research took more time than writing, and it was confounding sometimes. There is such good work on Ottoman Istanbul. There is yet to be a study of historical texts through the lens of gender and sexuality, and there are issues about the research, of course, naturally so far done, and how these two concepts, both of which are tangible yet performative categories, relate to each other, are leading questions in my current literary work. And they are necessary not only for the Ottoman studies, of course, but maybe less attended in this field. In the end, I am thankful to Çiğdem and Shirine for this experience. If it weren't for their incisive criticism and suggestions, their hand-holding through the process against my tardiness, somewhat caused by idealist attempt to capture all the issues around man and to picture that fluidity of masculinity in the streets of early modern Istanbul. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be able to write this chapter. And I am also thankful to Karen Leal for her valuable suggestions. I hope City of Man inspires further research that focuses on manhood, masculinity, patriarchy, with respect to spatial and more focused temporal matrices. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers. Now is the moment for the question and answers. I am for those who want to ask their questions using their own voices, please do raise your hands. Those who do not, I'm very happy to read out the questions, so please do use the chat box. And I will try to flag everyone, all the questions down as best as I can. If I do miss out, you know, Baki and Ümit, if you're there, do alert me. As there's often always this sort of moment of silence. Oh, does Baki has a hand up? Baki, go for it.
Oh, thank you, Denis. I hope others would also follow me. I want to give people opportunity to think about what they might ask by asking Selim a question. Selim, you talked about men, and I know that the book actually also includes a chapter on women, but the author is not here. So I'm going to put you on the spot, not necessarily as the author of the chapter on men, but as the man who knows all about the literature, the representation of men and women in literature. I'm curious, in this period that we bracket between, as I understand, from late 15th to early 18th centuries, are there locations where men and women meet? I mean, I can think of Hevesname in the late 15th century as an example where we actually see them meeting. I can think of in the 18th century Zenanname, etc., where we are seeing that women all are around. But I think you might be able to come up with more to bring women into this.
Into the picture. Yes, like, of course, women have always been in the picture. I said it was a provocation, and also I was thinking about the oppressive, cruel, monstrous side of the urban setting, especially in that district again, which I call the kernel of Istanbul now. Like, kind of women needed to perform like masculine gestures, or their cowardliness is generally stressed, but in fact it was their courage to enter into this mixed environment. And women were can be evaluated in multiple categories, from the noble lady to the prostitute, who had different manners of engaging in the city. But my argument, which is again a provocation, is that the setting, especially of this kernel, or the rest of any urban setting in early modern period in, let's call it Western Asia, West, East, etc., was intended for male performances. This is a major argument. And then women might have needed to step into such performances. So femininity and masculinity, because some men choose to perform feminine gestures, etc., because this was their desire, or because they were pushed to perform those things due to their desires, etc. These are all open to discussion. But I was kind of thinking blueprint was a masculine identity, like represented by buildings, etc. And Lucien Thais Şenocak did a great counterpoint to my chapter by displaying the rich female performances on different levels again. So I loved reading both chapters back to back and following Cemais. This is the order kind of a thing, which points to many of these things that I mentioned and mentioned in the rest of the book in different articles as well. So my neglect of women was depend on two reasons. One was there's a huge neglect of underscoring masculinity or manhood in Ottoman studies, which focuses women when it comes to history and gender, and homosociality, homoeroticism when it comes to sexuality, neglecting kind of this huge major category which we take for granted and kind of resist against, because history was written by men. But who were these men? And not only the history writers, but the writers of the city, like those masses of people who may not be interested in homoerotic relations, or who were not identified as women, etc. And this variety is more difficult to is still more difficult to conceptualize for me at the state. I think this is the comment on the state of the field. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ümit, go for it.
I would like to ask actually a more general methodological question for Shirine and Çiğdem. This is something they actually talk about in their introduction, but this is something that as historians, we all suffer from that. Has to do with the issue of continuities and breaks, these chronological frameworks, and where does the early modern starts, where does it end? I was wondering how they dealt with it during the editing process. They actually mention the issue of the problem of what came before, right? And there's also the problem of what came after. So these are, after all these chronological frameworks are, you know, heuristic tools for us to make to produce a narrative, but at the same time, there's always this potential of, you know, things that are left out, things that are included. And finally, I was wondering whether your authors, your contributors, you know, and their contributions, their submissions pushed you to think and rethink actually the chronological framework of early modern in any sense. Thank you.
Yes. Do you want to, do I?
I don't know.
I mean, yeah, well, that is of course the huge question, and also as you, Ümit, know well, and of course others in the audience too, it's not a resolved issue at all, either in world history, in global history, or in Ottoman studies, or in European history, for that matter. So we kind of live with the problem of the continuities and, you know, what comes before and what comes after. And I guess we kind of decided to live with this at some point, but recognizing that what we were ultimately interested in was, and again, thanking our authors, the kind of in-depth, close work, historically grounded work that helps us, you know, identify and trace what we may define as early modern and what the links may be to the medieval era as much as to what we define as modernity. And one of the, at least to my mind, you know, fruitful aspects of doing this was the recognition that, you know, within all this, you know, again, you know, unresolved debate on, you know, what we do with the early modern, do we define an Ottoman early modernity, and so on, the possibility it offers for a more kind of, again, historically based, comparative, global kind of study. And here we kind of also remembered writing the introduction that some of the very initial work on, you know, early modern global connections actually came from outside of the Western world and from scholars working on East and South Asia, and you know, recognizing that, you know, as much as we cannot you know, identify this particular point in time where the early modern starts, we also need to recognize that there will be different dynamics identifiable in different parts of this world. So that is generally on you know, our take, and again with the strong conviction that that we do need more work to really, you know, identify and define some of these connections. And maybe the second part of your question I will leave to Shirine, as I also continue to think about it. One of the things, let me just very, very quickly,
Of course, there are absences in the book. And one of the things that would have been interesting and worthwhile to do would be to have a closer look at, Istanbul before its takeover by the Ottomans. So to look at basically late medieval Byzantium and Eastern Mediterranean and the world around it. And that is also one of the areas that to my mind is kind of waiting for more work, for identifications of more developments that have to do with at the center in the city, but also in the larger geographies that the city belongs to.
Yeah, I think, some of it, I don't want to do a lot of repeat, but I think this necessity for more and more and continuously more historically grounded work in this, like you said, roughly defined time span, because useful as a heuristic tool, is probably, will probably help answer your question, essentially. Because for now, no matter what we debate, what we see, connections, the more evidence we have, is just as simple as this. The more historical identification of certain features, of certain connections, of certain characteristics, of some developments, the more we can place all these pieces of the puzzle together. In terms of did the author's contributions help us rethink? Yes, a lot. Like I was saying at the very beginning, it is really this cumulative work that hits you in the face at some point, and you really start silently, not sometimes not very consciously, also seeing links, seeing new connections, rephrasing the way you describe certain or privilege certain things over others in this rough time span. Now I know you're not trying to put us on the spot to give you a particular example, so I won't try to go there, but definitely the reading all these chapters together is an amazing exercise, really. It's really an amazing exercise. Yeah.
We have, I think, 4 more minutes, right, Baki? Or should we just, would you say we keep on going? You should unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask a very quick question to Gülru Hocam. Gülru Hocam, I was wondering whether the end of times ever disappears in the way you think about architecture and the city. I am curious in the sense that while the end of times is always upon us in sort of medieval era and is still very much there in the beginning of early modern era, there are still messianic movements, I think, all to the 17th century for sure, definitely. But then at some point, messianic movements sort of become rarer, and then the imagination of the Ottoman state becomes ever present, as if the state is just going to be eternal, and a more secular kind of open-ended time develops. At least that is how I imagine it, and that's how it happens in sort of Western European sort of developments. And in my own case, I thought this was happening in historiography. Is there any way of catching that, like a particular juncture where the times become a little bit more open-ended, as if the end of times might never come, or do you feel like it's always with us? The stories keep circulating even through the 18th century.
Thank you. That's a great question. I agree with you that it's even though it doesn't disappear, it kind of fades into the background, this end of times discourse. So I mentioned in my essay that this is more prominent in the kind of 15th through late 16th centuries, and that really with this I go well into the 18th century, because one of the strange things that I noticed, which I hadn't before, I had assumed that over time these disasters would disappear or get lesser. On the contrary, there's a statistical MA thesis done on fires. They like exponentially increased in the 18th and especially the 19th centuries, where by that time in Europe, they had pretty much solved this problem. So, but you are right that these later events kind of are not as deeply involved in a kind of end of times discourse, although they always cite it. So, for example, in the famous mid 17th century earthquake, fire, the text that describes it by Eremia Çelebi says that this was like the last judgment, and there was no food, all the water had disappeared. It was like in the middle of July. It was like, this was worse than the end of time kind of thing. So it was, I think, always mentioned as something that people thought about, whereas in the early times, it's more part of a broader mindset, if that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we are right at our 90-minute mark. I would like to thank to all of you for giving your time today to present and our audience to meet us. But of course, I would like to especially thank to the organizers of the Yavuz Sezer Article Prize in the History of Architecture and Urban Environment, our newest addition to our prizes. Once again, please remember the deadline, April 30th, and I will make sure to follow up with an email again to HTurk, and hopefully we can also send an email to historians of Islamic architecture or a relevant email list to remind everyone. Articles and book chapters that do deal with history of architecture and urban environment in Ottoman Empire and Turkey are all eligible. Authors can nominate themselves. Colleagues can nominate other authors, and a PDF is needed to be sent to Çiğdem Kafescioğlu, who will be the chair of the committee this year. Once again, thank you so much for creating this prize, the Friends of Yavuz Sezer, and thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.